But where we're moving to now is public sector, and of course a robust and well-functioning public sector is something that often we don't notice it when things are going well. And I think it's when things go wrong that we really notice the importance of this robust and transparent public sector. So this session is going to be taking a look at the public sector in New Zealand, including the extent to which we are still world-class. We've got three great panellists who all know each other and have been having lots of conversations, so we'll direct those conversations to our audience now. Our first panellist will be Sir Maarten Wevers, delighted to have him along here, former New Zealand diplomat and senior public servant, bringing a wealth of experience from those roles. Then we have Graham Scott, former Secretary to the Treasury, former New Zealand Productivity Commissioner, and Anne Tolley, Commissioner for Tauranga City Council, former MP and Government Minister. So all names that are known quite well to many of us. So with that, please.
Thank you, Anna. Kia ora tātou. Great pleasure to be here and to share the platform with Graham and Anne. I found it all a bit depressing so far, so when I mentioned that to Anna, she said, "Are you going to liven it up and make it more positive?" I said, "Well, no, but you know, when lots of problems are put in front of you, you know, the natural solution is to say, well, the natural question is to say, well, how can these be fixed?" And that's a really, really good question to ask. The session is a robust public sector. Are we still world class? The inference that it seems to me we are being invited to draw, of course, at some stage in the past we did have a world class public sector. I don't think personally, I don't know what the others think, that was ever true. Certainly not across the board. But there were certain periods in our past, and as I was saying to Graham, if you go back to the 1890s with labour market and then 1930s with the welfare state, there were areas where New Zealand was really innovative and earned a reputation and delivered on significant social or economic reforms that then were emulated and have been bedded in and have been very successful. The question is, are we still in that sort of space or not? What I'd like to say is it's quite important here to distinguish between our democratic systems and our public sector, although they're closely linked, because it's certainly true that in New Zealand we enjoy one of the most stable and long-standing, open and unchallenged democracies globally. And that's something to be really, really grateful for. Our national institutions are broadly stable. They run by the rule of law. We have an independent judiciary. By and large, we have a very trusted police force, which is true in very few places in the world. And we have regular and uninterrupted and peaceful transfers of democratic power. So, you know, a lot of people would give everything to get that sort of package if they could. And some areas we work very well. I think of the Office of the Auditor General, which is a very robust and long-standing office. And as chair, I think, of Transparency International in New Zealand, I think this year we're second in the world. We have been first for a number of years. That's independently done, and there are a number of other measures like that about trust in government and government institutions are very high compared internationally. And it's also true that apparently a lot of the democracies at the moment are under pressure, and trust in government has diminished quite sharply over the COVID period around democracies. I think it's probably a little too early to say what the score is with trust in government in New Zealand, because the data is probably not out. But certainly there are a lot of positives in our system. But it seems to me that the organisers in posing this question suggest that they're worried about the nature and the quality of advice that's going from officials, of which Graham and I were both long-standing officials, given to ministers in cabinet processes, or perhaps the nature and the quality and the direction of decisions being taken by ministers and the executive, or agency chief executives of the boards of state-owned enterprise or Crown entities. I think it's really important also to distinguish between the robust institutions I've talked about, which I think are, you know, they're by and large good. They can all be improved, whether at the board level or, you know, you'll have ministers who are better than others and chief executives are better than others and all that sort of stuff. But taking that all out of the wash, the systems operate reasonably strongly. But the question is, what can we do to improve that, and how do you do that? Now, the peak bodies for dealing with our public sector and guiding it, of course, are the national institution is the national institution of the Parliament, and from the Parliament, the team that becomes the Cabinet, because they enjoy the confidence of the House. They are charged with trying to coordinate all of the aspects of the state in this country, which is the broad term of the public sector. So, and that's literally hundreds of organisations. I mean, we all know we've got 2,500 secondary schools or schools, but there are organisations, ministries, departments, departmental agencies, a range of diverse service providers locally. We've got local government, of course. We've got regulatory agencies and essential democratic and judicial institutions. Finding alignment, cohesion, and as Karen Sewell-Forrest, Secretary of the Ministry of Education, used to say, her job in the Education Department is to keep the herd moving roughly west. And I always rather like that expression because it's not quite like herding cats, but it's not far off it. And that's really, I'm sure, the role that Jim Bolger and others of his colleagues had when they were sitting at the cabinet table. This is a behemoth, and it's really quite difficult and extremely daunting to work out what to address and when. So it seems to me, from the time that I've spent working just over 10 years in the Beehive and seeing and advising ministers and prime ministers at very close quarters, and as Graham, I'm sure, will attest, that focusing on some key planks and doing them well and consistently over years really pays dividends. The taxation reforms of the 80s, the state-owned enterprise reforms, the whole liberation of agriculture from the regulations that they had to make them responsive and live on their own wits, and where they've become a very important and improved part of our economic life. And that really devolved from a decision strategically to look at agriculture completely differently. So those sorts of big things are big multipliers. So thinking of the conversations we've had today, if somehow through the agencies that have responsibility for the education system, the immigration system, and the fiscal system, which are conversations that have come up already today, if we could get those humming, a lot of other things would fall into place naturally. So the challenge for the leaders in the public sector, which are essentially the cabinet, are how to work out which of those issues to pick and what advice they should receive, and then what decisions they should make. And there's a big difference between provision of policy advice, which was our domain, and making the decisions, which were the domain that Jim and Anne were in, and they often get conflated in the public mind. I'd make the point that the way in which the Westminster system operates in New Zealand, I think it's now quite different from the way it originally started in the UK, and certainly the way it runs now. I think Jim Bolger would be horrified at the way they run the British cabinet system. And as we saw, the Prime Minister of Australia recently, in secret, appointed himself to several portfolios without telling anybody. I don't know how the Cabinet Secretary there could sleep at night, or any others, and the Canadians have a very strange view of the way these things run. So it's pretty tight. The New Zealand Cabinet runs with only Cabinet Ministers in the room when it's meeting in full, with one official, who was somebody who worked in the department I used to head, the Cabinet Secretary, and that's there to act as a sort of as a corporate secretary for the process. But it's politicians alone who are making the decisions. That's quite unusual in the Westminster system. Bringing officials into those conversations all the time changes the dynamic and changes the responsibility for taking the tough calls. That's a great strength of our system. But the issues are hard. It's not an easy job. In fact, it's an extremely difficult job being the Prime Minister, even of this country. Most of the issues that we have are the same that bigger countries with bigger resources also have to grapple with. We don't have the military heft or the economic heft or the scientific heft that others have because of our scale, and we have wonderful attributes because of the place we live in, but there are also, as we know, things from the tyranny of distance. So the challenges are real, and they bubble up, and then things happen, like cyclones, like earthquakes, like recessions, and they all put pressure on the institutions, and they divert the public sector from what they thought was their day job into responding to a crisis. So in terms of are we still world class, as I've said, I don't think we ever were across the system. There are some areas where we did really well, but then we go off the boil a bit. So it's time to get things back on the boil. The questions would be which. For my mind, I think there's been a lack of, a reduction of focus. I think the butter has been spread too thinly. that there's been a lack of focus on the things that really matter, the ones that would have big multiplier effects. And I think, again, education and immigration are two that have already come up today. I think there's a lack of urgency in the way in which a lot of the public sector agencies respond to changes of circumstances. I was at DPMC when we had the Canterbury earthquake, so I was leading the emergency response in the Beehive bunker, literally for days on end, and hearing Rob talk today about the inability, or the growing inability of the health system to listen to and respond to offers which were well-grounded, of enormous goodwill from the community and the business community to try and help with the COVID response, I found deeply disheartening. I think there's a general issue that openness to external voices is not as strong as it should be in the system that is providing advice, and that can be improved. I think we have far too many portfolios, far too many public service organisations in the state sector. I think in the local government area we still have too many small councils, numerous councils with only 10,000 ratepayers, and critical mass is really lacking. There is, of course, a legitimate political economy discussion about the level of representation between over-centralisation in one hand and too many small entities on the other, and that's a really difficult thing. But I remember the time before the 1986, I think it was, local government reforms, when we had 300 local councils in New Zealand. I come from the Wairarapa. There were separate councils for Greytown, for Martinborough, for Featherston, and for Marston. Now they're down to 3, but it's only 1 down, and they should probably only have 1. So we're not as bad as we used to be, but we certainly have great scope for improving further. So I think I'll just leave it there. There were a lot of things that came to mind in those discussions. The role in the public sector often is to deal with strange combinations of, I would say, mundane, but I don't want to devalue them, regular day-to-day services which support the lives of citizens, whether it's about paying taxes or providing regular services for everything that everybody does all the time, including infrastructure, electricity, all that sort of stuff. Things that we just expect to happen, and generally in this country they do happen. Then there are all the pressures for when there are crises, and I think we've seen again in Hawke's Bay and certainly in Canterbury and other occasions when this community still does have a lot of social capital and it can pull together. And then we see a lot of people who are employed in the public sector at local or central level going well above and beyond and delivering to their communities as we all expect them to do, and that's something for which we're all eternally grateful. But making sure that those entities are designed appropriately and resourced appropriately to handle both the regular stuff and continuous improvement and new technology and all that sort of stuff, and being ready for when the big wave comes across, which is normally unexpected and it doesn't happen where you think, is a really tricky balance. And of course the whole thing, which I haven't even mentioned, comes with cost, and then the really big question about value for money. And I think there's a real question to be asked now about how much value are we getting for a lot of the services that are being undertaken in our name. Where does the balance lie between policy advice, the Crown entities, the ministers, and how proposals for improvement are made and how decisions are taken? I mean, we could have several more sessions on that, but it's not easy.
Let's leave with that rhetorical question.
And we'll pass that over.
Let's pass it over to Graham
Okay.
and see how Graham comes up with solutions.
Well, look, thank you. I agree with Maarten that there's a lot to be pleased about with the New Zealand public sector by comparison with its peers, but frankly that's not saying much these days. There is a lot, and you can see a recitation of this in the work that the Public Service Commission published in December, which recites a lot of positive things about the public service, but this topic sets a higher bar than that. Are we world class? And I would agree with Maarten that we have been in some places at some times, which means are we there today in the places we ought to be? And I'll resist the temptation to make wild generalizations because I only look at the public sector from the outside these days. So I'll talk about 3 things I know something about and see if there is a generalization from that. Well, my 3 topics are policy capability, fiscal institutions, and the use of data. On policy capability, I suggest we lack deep, continuing and productive policy analysis on some of the major problems that New Zealand faces. There's a risk of groupthink, which I see some of around the public service. There seems to be a lack of creative tension. People are so busy being polite to each other, they don't argue much anymore, it seems. Whereas the public service I remember was actually a pretty hard school, and that had its downsides, but you didn't go into a meeting if you hadn't done your homework, or if you did, you didn't say anything. There's been a loss of a kind of skepticism. Something I loved about the old public sector was there was a bit of a sort of prison camp ethic. You all were out trying to persuade politicians to do what you thought the right thing. You'd come back with half marks and get together and have a bit of a session with your friends in the department and say things that you would never say in front of ministers to get it off your chest. And I sort of miss that. I wonder if there is this sort of sense there any longer. Besides the missing or inadequate policy advice that I can see, there's a lack of careful institution analysis about how to deliver services, which has been crippling for the present government, in my view. Because there's a natural bias in the central government towards centralisation. It's in the incentives. Some people say that's politicisation. For me, as an economist, I say, well, if people are employed by the public sector and they're working for ministers who are ambitious to improve their careers and so on, there's a tendency for this whole thing to get bigger and bigger because every solution looks like another opportunity to accrete something, which is exactly what you've heard from Maarten. I think the centralisation has gone far too far in education and in the public service as well, and is damaging some very successful collaborations in health. And the curious thing in the health reform is being done with a thick rhetoric about empowerment of local people, empowering local voice and so on. But when you stand back and look at it, it's a gigantic Crown entity with something like 82,000 employees, probably the biggest sort of organisation in that sense in New Zealand. And working with the Kapiti District Council to try and put together a locality health network, you find you're talking to somebody on working for the fourth level of management inside this giant, and the answer is don't call us, we'll call you. We're not ready to talk to you yet. So there's a kind of, I think, non-cognitive dissonance in there about working with communities, supporting people, but when it gets to the practical reality, there's still a lot of traditional bureaucratic behaviour, and you shouldn't expect a big bureaucracy to behave as if it's not. So in some ways, talking about agile bureaucracies is an oxymoron. There's a mistrust of sector specialists in the culture today. I don't know how widespread it is, but it seems to me that the engineers got kicked out of planning years ago and they should come back. When I listen to really difficult debates about monetary policy today, it troubles me that if you want to have an opinion on monetary policy, which is well-founded, you'd better have studied monetary theory at graduate level, worked in the area for a few years and maybe done some research. It's the same with the regulation of a lot of industries. This isn't for amateurs. You've got to be good at this stuff or you make really damaging mistakes. So I wonder if there's been a downgrading of technical skill. Almost 10 years ago, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet started a framework for training public policy analysts, which is world-class and is used in other countries and is mentioned in the Public Services Commission report. But my sense overall is that it's lying in the shadow a bit these days. It's a brilliant tool and needs to be resuscitated and used much more aggressively than it is. Secondly, on fiscal institutions, and what I mean by that are the rules of the game, the practices, the culture, the flows of data, the decision rights that sit in the fiscal system, not the particular decisions. Well, the New Zealand financial reporting system is still the best in the world because it's the most integrated in the world, and it's something to be very pleased about. But I think there's been a steady erosion of the teeth it once had, so we're now at a point where you've got government agencies with multi-category, multi-year appropriations. In other words, it's a bucket of money. And how you work out what that's been spent on and what you've got for it can be a problem. The government largely ignored the requirements in the Public Finance Act for fiscal responsibility when COVID hit, and I can understand that in practical sense. God knows, it must have been awful being in the Treasury at that time. But these clauses were simply ignored, and they need to be worked on further to bring them back to a sense of bipartisan agreement and have the Parliament taking them seriously, which it's not been doing. It troubles me that the long-term fiscal outlook, which Jim Bolger talked about earlier, we've been looking at that demographic fiscal bomb since the mid-90s, and we still don't have a coherent and well put together framework for what options you might use to do something about it. And I think while the cost-benefit analysis systems in the Treasury have been tuned up by the Living Standards framework, I've got to say I'm sceptical of the value of large dashboards covered in wellbeing indications when I don't know what you do with them to make decisions. And a report from Simon Upton, Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, recently is quite blistering in that regard and says MPs can't see any longer what they spent money on and what they got for it. And I think it's high time to have a good look and see if all of that's producing what you wanted. I'm also troubled that monetary and fiscal policy has got blurred again, with the consequence that the Reserve Bank lost $9 billion over the COVID monetary policy, and people of my age remember that the reason we separated in the first place was because Sir Robert Muldoon got the Reserve Bank to lose an amount of money which would be several billion today, intervening in the foreign exchange markets. And so I think that's a mistake that's been made that needs sorting out. Look, there's a lot more to be said about that, but that's my second thing. Let's tune up the fiscal institutions. Finally, on data. I don't think the public sector is on the frontiers of data science in areas I'm familiar with, and there's a lot that can be done, particularly if social investment comes back in as a government policy. There's a lot that can be used there. People are obviously aware that the so-called Web 3.0 wave of innovations is hitting all over the world at the moment. It'll be 10 years for it to mature. But for us to take advantage of this, there are 4 things that have to happen: data sovereignty, data standards, data interoperability, and trusted storage. Now, if these developments can take place, and we're doing some things with them, but if they pushed much harder, then I would hope we'd get an explosion of impact investment, doing all sorts of innovative things in social policy, environmental policy, regenerative agriculture, and so on, which simply can't happen at the moment without free-flowing data running across the system. And I think the public sector has to get used to the idea that it won't be in control of all of this. It will be a player in it, but it will no longer run it. The IDI will be becoming a smaller portion of the total. So let me leave it there. If there's a theme for me, it's that we've got too many centralised solutions and that we lack real skill in the institutional analysis, which is very painstaking work to be able to unpick these delivery systems and make the best use of modern data. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Gosh, I almost want to rewrite what I was going to say, but however, kia ora tātou, ngā mihi nui, and good afternoon everyone. Look, I've worked in the public sector in both local and central government for more years than I care to remember, so that's where I'm going to focus today. And my first question on the comment on the question is, have we ever been world class? And in my view, the answer is no, and in many respects, I think we're probably going backwards. So I think our public sector is justifiably held in high regard, as Martin referred to. I am chair of Transparency International, and for probity and transparency, we are world class. I do have some doubts about the growing power of the executive, but that's another topic for another day. But if we're talking about making a judgment on our overall standing in the world, we have to base that on the results, the outcomes that we achieve. And I think that there, all too often, we fall very short of world class. The relationship between local government and central government is fraught with conflict and frustration. And there's a huge disconnect between governance, policy, and implementation responsibilities, which causes that conflict and endless processes. Talk about bureaucracy, that's where it is at its best. The public sector has a huge focus on planning, which is appropriate. It's something we do need to do, but it all seems to fall to pieces when it comes to the delivery. The source of ongoing frustration is the lack of joined-up decision-making between government departments, and ministers have to take responsibility for that, and between our 78 authorities, territorial authorities, particularly as it refers to infrastructure funding and delivery. And the funding is often available, lots of it, but it sometimes feels like the various government funding pots available are designed more to apply oil to the squeaky wheel, or as has already been referred to, announcements by ministers, than to ensure sound urban growth, economic growth and prosperity, and system-wide infrastructure. And the result is that in local government, we have parts of funding stacks required to make any sort of progress, but not in the time frame that we need it, and with contributions that are contingent on funding agreements from other arms of government. And the example of that I would give is Waka Kotahi, who, it's a hypothecated fund, so it only ever can fund what it can afford, not what is needed. It can only commit to funding for 3 years, and yet local government is required to do infrastructure planning and financial planning over 10 years. And those two are not even aligned, so that when local government comes to do its 10-year plan, it knows what the 3-year funding commitment from Waka Kotahi is. How on earth can you plan infrastructure with that sort of, that's where the conflict and the frustration comes. However, I have to say that in a crisis, somehow we manage to pull it all together. And all the Crown agencies come to the table with their dollars. We get tangata whenua sitting at the table, often with their dollars, and we get local government sitting there with their dollars. And the examples of that are all too recent. So if you look at what happened in Christchurch following the earthquake, we got thousands of hectares of land opened up for building. And yet you try and do that today, you're talking a 10-year process that might end up in the courts. We got the Crown committing to major infrastructure building in the CBD in order to give confidence to the private sector to reinvest. And then if you look at that magnificent Kaikoura to Christchurch highway that was built following the Kaikoura earthquakes, built in half the time, on budget, planned in 1/10 of the time that it takes nowadays to get a highway. What we have is magnificent. That is truly world class. We have amenity values for both commuters and for visitors. We have good environmental outcomes, and we have mana whenua co-design. That is looking at world-class public service. So I'm absolutely positive when we look at cyclone-ravaged areas like Tairāwhiti and Hawke's Bay, that the dollars on the table and the clear expectations as to what is to be achieved, I have no doubt that will all work. My question is, why can't it always be like that? Because that would certainly be world class. Kia ora tātou.
Well, thank you very much to our panellists for really getting us to think through these issues and link them back to a lot of the discussions that have been going on earlier this morning, and the encouragement also to have very frank conversations I think we should take on board. If there are questions from the floor, please do wave out and we'll get a microphone over to you. Otherwise, I think I'm going to make a start on a question. You know, you all made this comment that we maybe used to be world class, or maybe are world class in some areas, but there are certainly other areas where we're far from world class. How would we go about getting world class? Would we look to other countries? Are there particular other countries that we would look to? Where would we look to inform this moving towards world class? It's actually for all of you, so you may decide who.
Look, in the areas that I spoke about, it's clear that the outer edges of the use of data is in the United States. They're so far ahead. I mean, the fact that there's all sorts of bad things going on there as well, there's also a lot of very good things. And I'm presently working for one of the blockchain foundations in the United States. I'm just astonished, really, at the skills that are in the generation of New Zealanders who have all these contacts deep into Silicon Valley and so on, what they're able to bring here. But they're all frustrated that they can't get things done. I mean, take something really simple like the anti-money laundering requirements if you're going to launch what they call a digital autonomous organisation, which muddles up the role of being a shareholder or a director or a manager. Of course, our regulatory systems are all based on the idea it's a company with a shareholder and directors, you're somebody to hold accountable. Well, with a digital autonomous organisation, that's all a blur. And so, what we're trying to work on is how would you have a regulatory system, because these things are financial products, you're asking people to put money in. How do you adapt the regulatory system to allow this to happen? And I think, as I mentioned earlier, this could release a huge amount of energy to get this right. But where is the energy that's around saying, well, hang on, let's think about how we do regulate these kinds of things? So actually getting funded from another country to think about it.
Any other comments?
I think we could look very closely at experience of our own communities. It's not all offshore, but there is stuff offshore. I mean, my son is working in the energy sector in the UK. He says there are things they'd love to do with their energy firm in New Zealand, but the regulatory environment simply doesn't permit it. And this wonderful organisation here is filled with ambitious people who are making their lives offshore at the moment, a lot of whom want to come home or may want to assist in some way. I think part of that is just opening up some of those windows that Rob was talking about before to the private sector and others, expatriates or new migrants. I mean, the great thing about a liberal and open democracy with open information systems is that all voices can be heard. There's no magic holy grail to this thing, but if you look at world's best practice, there are any number of fora that enable world best practice to be shared, but we don't have a methodical system. And often in the policy design stage, I know it was different at your time, Graham, in the 80s, because there was a real crisis. You were well informed about what was going on offshore. I don't see that as a regular part of the policy process now, that people say, where is this being done really well? There's a reluctance, I think, to be open to that sort of not invented here type of thing. I think we're quite defensive about it. It has to be invented here, otherwise
Although
it's not
you did
valid.
say we should look in the local communities
but
as
you
well,
do
so it's
both.
getting that balance,
It's not either or. You look at all of them and you test it and you throw it out there, and you do it with some speed and alacrity and don't take 3 or 4 years,
Anne?
So I think at the ministerial level, certainly you do look overseas, you do look to see where it's being done well, and before COVID you'd go and have a look, and I did that on a number of occasions. But you've always got to be careful that what you see in another country is not necessarily be able to be replicated in New Zealand. And the classic is probably, the most recent one is the Three Waters, based on what happened in Scotland. Now, there's certain advantages in the systems, but you've got to put it into the local situation, and you've got to put it into the local population. You've got to make sure it's going to work in New Zealand, and that's often where I think we fail, is that we try and pick up something from overseas and put it into New Zealand without that different lens on it. And I agree with Maarten. Within our communities, there's enormous resourcefulness and that willingness to do things just to get it done, and that's the character of New Zealanders, isn't it? We're the number 8 wire type people. But we're stifled by regulation. We're just making it so difficult for ourselves. And if you talk to anyone in infrastructure at the moment in construction, prices are going through the roof at sort of 20 to 30% increases. And then when you drive along a road where there's roadworks happening, we're down to 1 lane and we're 50 metres away from where a digger might be. Sometimes I try hard to find where a person on that digger is, but and we don't work 24 hours. If you go to Japan and they're putting in infrastructure, they're working 24 hours. They have to get it done. We don't do that. It's hugely costly. So we just pile regulation and bureaucracy on top of it until it just all takes so long, it's so hard, and our innovative people end up going overseas, finding somewhere else where it's a bit easier. I'm sorry.
We need some more solutions happening here, don't we? Can we take a question from the floor, please?
Yeah, if I could, the theme earlier today is sort of a thread through all the conversation so far has been about the central and local government as a provider of service to our community, companies, businesses, social and economic organisations, and the hurdles that government sometimes can provide. I wanted to just pick up on the theme of data and metrics and outcomes and ask the panel whether you can see parallels from the economic regulation of other monopoly providers of services in New Zealand, whether it's electricity, airports, telco, and are there any lessons we should take from that which might start to focus the government agencies on the right outcomes? Because in my experience, there's nothing more powerful than the sunlight of information to cause those who are accountable for those things to change behaviour and do something about it.
I mentioned data. Yeah, I mean, I think if they bring back in some version some of the techniques that were used in social investment, there's still a cadre of data analysts around the ministries, but they don't seem to have access to leadership positions or decision making. But they would be able to do exactly what you're talking about. I mean, and just to give you simple examples, the analysis has been done that knows what you potentially save by kids who are taken into the state care one way or another, and the condition that they're in at the time they arrive, having used historical data, and then saying the probability of people who arrive like this having a certain life outcome with obviously a distribution of things around that, and not only the cost of that, the lives that these people have, is simply enormous. And we've known that. Those experiments started in 2005, and I think you had something to do with them. But somehow or other that still hasn't become embedded as a core decision-making tool right in the places it ought to be. And I think you could bring it all back in about 6 months, frankly.
And you get into a bit of politics on that. So, sorry, I'm picking up on that because I tried to do a lot of work with those vulnerable children, but the politics, why would we call them vulnerable? We got rid of the word vulnerable. Actually, they are the most vulnerable in our communities. They should be top of it, but they still have to go through all the different hoops of all the different criteria that all the different government departments have. And that's mirrored in infrastructure, which you and I were just talking about earlier. That waka kotahi, when it is deciding on whether to build a particular road, is only looking at the benefits of transport. It doesn't take into account what's happening on either side of that transport and whether there's any housing that's released or commercial activity that's released that would account for the value. So when we come to those individual government departments, and we tried hard as ministers, and I know there's efforts to try and amalgamate some of that so that you look at things in the whole, and all fall short. I don't understand why, but maybe it's something in our structure that we all go back into our departments, and all of you go back into your departments, and the ministers all go back into theirs, and get on with that individual piece of work. It just seems hard to bring that all together, whether it's in social welfare or whether it's in infrastructure.
I think just to add in support of that last comment of Anne's, we do have a vertical structure between ministers with portfolio responsibilities which are legislated for. One of the things I forgot to mention is we are, quite unusual in being pretty good about operating within the rule of law in New Zealand, and that is a really valuable thing. And I remember talking to both of the Prime Ministers I work closely with, saying, if any ministers think it's good to cut corners, you go and have a look at the record of judicial review against ministers' decisions, and it's the court's 100, ministers 1, so it's not a path they want to go down. But the collaboration stuff is really hard, and it takes time, and there's a lot of inertia, and sometimes you can sort it out occasionally quite well at officials level, and then it gets to the cabinet level and it gets unpicked a bit, or then you've got legislation through the House and there's more unpicking. So there are a lot of voices that are willing to be raised about why things shouldn't be done, and that's really quite grinding both for ministers and for officials, and sometimes you can find yourselves a year later back in the same position. So that's really frustrating. So, it needs a bit of a shake-up. I mean, that's the sort of thing, rejuvenation.
We've got a question down the back.
Is that working? Yeah. Kia ora, Anna Woods from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Just maybe a comment more than a question, but there was a reference to, the importance of New Zealand learning from overseas. And just a little bit of a good news story. I run a couple of streams in the Economic Division. One of them is Policy Insights, where we task our posts overseas. We work with domestic agencies on policies that they're interested in bringing in New Zealand or changing. So a recent one was we worked with the Ministry for the Environment on New Zealand's nationally determined contribution strategy, and they went out to our posts around the network, went out and spoke to experts and partner governments who had worked on NDC strategies and learned about what went well, what were challenges, with the intention of bringing that back to help with New Zealand's strategy that we're working on. Another one is the Small Advanced Economies Initiative. So that's an initiative New Zealand leads with fellow small advanced economies of Singapore, Switzerland, Ireland, Denmark, Finland, Israel. And again, it's an opportunity for officials to get together, learn from each other about what policies have worked, which haven't, to do that really key information sharing. And so we're not just tinkering away in the garage in New Zealand, we're learning from what has been, world class overseas. And of course, there's our work in the OECD, which again is those policy leads getting together and really working on best practice. So it is happening.
Good.
Well, it's nice to have a positive story. If you've got any, it was more of a comment, but if you wanted to respond, you may. Could we have a mic up to this table, please?
So picking up on that, and going back to the previous session on education, and we were always, I think for the last 20, 30 years have been looking at Finland and the education system in Finland, who always beat us at in the international results. But we know what is good about the Finnish system, and that is that they train their teachers well, extremely well, right through to master's level, and then they pay them extremely well, and they're highly regarded in their community. I think in New Zealand our teachers are highly regarded, but I don't think we train them to that level. And of course there's always the question that Susan raised of how much we paid them. So we attract the very best people. Why would a young scientist go into teaching and earn half the money that they could if they went into industry? So, we might know what's best practice internationally, but we're not always willing to pay the price of that best practice.
Thanks.
Yes, I also want to talk about learning from overseas, but almost to reverse it. I actually worked overseas for 20 years as a central banker, both as an active one and as an advisor. Throughout most of that period, the IMF and most other advisors in the area were using New Zealand as a role model for best practice. And not just in targets, but in things like governance, accountability, all those nitty-gritty issues of central banking. But at the same time, as New Zealand was being used as a role model almost everywhere I worked, New Zealand was reviewing what they were doing. We seemed to lose confidence in our own ability where we were regarded as a world leader by almost everybody else.
I'll comment on that. Peter, I mean, your experience with this has been astonishing, really, what you've done with your career. But I see it this way. What happened was that because of the crisis in the 80s, it called for bold measures. They were developed and implemented. And like any such thing, some of it works better than others. You get left with having left behind a wake of other second round effects that you've triggered off, and things were happening in the bit you weren't focusing on while you were concentrating on the crisis. So nothing lasts forever. There's in a democracy, it's always being adjusted. Now, what happened in New Zealand, in my view, is instead of the policies that were introduced at that time being comprehensively and intelligently critiqued to the point of saying, here is a well-defined better idea to apply to this or that or the other thing, what you got was a cacophony of academics who don't publish much in refereed international journals, if you see what I mean. Just with a mantra saying, well, this is all about outputs, we've got to do outcomes. It's, you know, bumper stickers like that, which have a strong grain of truth in them, but they never said, well, actually, if we did want to do outcomes better, how would we do it? Now, the consequence of that is that you've now had 35 years of steady erosion at the margins. It's not that you've gone from a system that was designed to deal with a particular situation and now you've got another one, so you do it again. It's just you keep filing the edges off the one that you inherited. And I think that's what's happened, which has ended up with, you know, me and a few others thinking it's time to have another review of our fiscal opportunities and institutions. You might not want to go back to those, something new. In fact, I'd argue seriously it should be new, but it's got to have teeth. And, you know, we've kind of lost the teeth. It's just turned to mush, you know.
Was there a question? Sorry, I thought there was a question at the back. Okay, let me go with one of the online questions that we've got then. That's come through, and you know, we've got this very sort of big beast, I think is a term I heard Maarten use at one stage, of different parts of the public sector. How do we succeed in optimising it and getting these different outcomes? It's such a big problem. Now, a short answer would be good, and I know you're better at identifying the problems and the solutions, but I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you, what do we do with this big beast, Maarten? How do we make progress?
When we were doing prep for this last week, I said that Helen Clark used to say to me several times a year, trouble with officials, Maarten, is that officials are really good at pointing out the problems and not so good at offering the answers. So I think you've come back to haunt me on that.
I've come back to haunt you. You're not a public official anymore.
Well, I think optimising the public sector, I think, is you know, an unattainable nirvana. To get it all right, you know, you've got to have good data. You know, you start from that. So good situational awareness, then good analysis, which requires, you know, people who are well skilled and trained and got good experience and are going to apply their intellect to interpreting what they see and then coming up with some options for policy choices, then being able to well present them persuasively and get ministers to understand and getting collaboration from other agencies. That's really powerful around the cabinet table. And then you've got to go have the right decision made, and timeliness is always important. And then, of course, there's the whole question of implementation that Anne talked about, and then evaluation to see what works. So that process is a really long thing. It may be, I mean, it's normally quite a number of years before you really see stuff, but those elements should appear in everything. But the question is, where do you apply it? Because the sector is so enormous. I mean, I don't think we'd agree. We don't need to have, I'm sure there can improvements that can be made to the judicial system, but upending the legal system and the courts now is probably not the biggest priority. So I think selecting some of the really big elements that are going to have bigger downstream effects, as I mentioned before about the agricultural reforms in the 80s, is similarly with the tax reforms. Really strong, bold positions and the fiscal and monetary policy settings. Once those were right, lots of other things started to fall into place. So I think some attention to, as a step towards optimisation, which I don't think you could ever achieve, is to have a sense about what are the really critical, you know, few areas where we need to embark on a journey of refreshing and reinvigorating, and as mentioned earlier today, making sure that we're competitive, and also I think the attractive to a migrant thing. I mean, I think that's been one of the casualties of the COVID thing, is that, as someone said earlier, that where the others are putting the welcome mat up, we're putting up a hand that's saying no, thank you very much. That can be devastating in the medium and long term, and I think there are some areas like that which really would be useful to look at in quite an intense and wide way, straight away, get a cluster of really big issues that you think are going to make a difference, and try and start moving the dial on those.
progress.
You can't do everything at once. It's a bit like local government. You can't, taking on the whole of local government at once is a bit tricky, but if you do bite-sized chunks, you might get some change.
And I
It's
guess
hard.
I'd like to
It's
turn
really
to you, Anne,
hard.
and ask you about these linkages between the local and central government. You know, the dysfunctions, and how do we improve those dysfunctions that might exist between those different layers?
I think the first thing we should do is go to a 4-year term for both of them, because that would allow much better analysis and give better time for implementation and seeing what works. So I think that's the first thing. 3 years turnover. And you think of the last, we've had literally two different governments in the last of the three years. And so you start all over again. Your public service changes, your ministers change, and so your policies change. The relationship between, it's trying to align, well, first of all, there has to be a trust between the two. So all too often central government doesn't trust local government to do the job, so they put more rules and regulations on them. They also put over to local government the jobs they don't really want to tackle or can't tackle politically. And you look at things like local alcohol policies and gambling, all of that's been put out to local government in order to get local decision making, which is good, but they are difficult issues to deal with at the political level. But no funding comes with that, no support comes with that. So all it does is make local government, it just affects that relationship between the two. And that's really at the core of it, is how those two essential parts of our public service actually work together, understand one another, and work to create a good place for people, for New Zealanders to live in, and a great country. And I mean, I've got lots of suggestions, but we haven't got time.
If there are questions from the floor, please wave out for a microphone. Otherwise, I'm going to turn to a comment that Rob Fife made this morning. And he talked about it was much easier to get decisions through if you've got a small number of people making those decisions. And I'm curious about your views on this. We've talked about how we might find solutions. Is one solution to move to much smaller groups of people making decisions, and what are the implications for democracy when we do these sorts of things? So I'm curious about your views on whether that's a way forward or a way backwards.
I had one comment on it. It's the question of collaboration. I mean, Jenny Shipley made a very important speech in 1997 when she was Minister of State Services, and she said, we've done what we're going to do with all that economy stuff. The new agenda is social policy, and the rules have got to be different because all of these things interact, and you need collaborative processes, and ministers are sick of hearing public servants arguing with each other in the cabinet. And she was right, because these social policy problems inherently need integrated solutions, and they're much harder to get. But I've got a thought I'll express. It's a bit risky, but I think collaboration is expensive. It leads to interdepartmental committee meetings with 30 people at them, and
If you're lucky.
and a bit more attention. Do we need to collaborate about this? Can't we just say, look, this is your issue, go fix it? Because if you look at some of the most heroic things that's happened in New Zealand, like maybe the management of the Second World War, history says it was done by a small handful of people who actually did a very good job. They didn't set up an interdepartmental coordinating committee to figure out how to prosecute the war. So I think a lot more care about where you need to get complex and expensive collaborations, and where you can just delegate the job to somebody and tell them to go and do it.
I agree. Well, I'm a commissioner with 4 commissioners in place from a council of, I think it was 12 councillors and a mayor. And you do have to be careful that you are getting a diversity of thought around the table, because I mean, when I first started in local government in the Napier City Council, and I think there were 12 councillors, and if we all agreed on something, I'd often think, have we asked enough questions? This isn't right. If the community never all agrees on something. So you do need to make sure that you get a variety of skills and a variety of views around your decision-making tables. I get really worried when we start saying we need to have diversity, and actually we're not talking diversity of skills or thought. We're talking diversity about different groups of people, whether it's from different backgrounds, from different ethnicities, from different genders, etc. And the key to decision making is having, I think, a reasonable number of people well versed in the topic, having done their homework, and prepared to make a decision. Because in the end, governance requires decisions. And all too often, both at central and local levels, we see governance that is not prepared to make the hard decisions. It is tough to go out, it's going to be tough to go out and say to some communities, I'm sorry, but we're not going to rebuild in that place ever again. That's going to be a really tough decision that we're going to have to be saying right across the country. I'm sorry, but we're not going to allow you to rebuild or to build in that place because it is not safe. So you know, really strong decision makers have those skills that I've just outlined. What the numbers are, I don't know. I don't think 4 is enough to run the 5th largest city in New Zealand. I think you do need more than that to get that diversity of thought particularly. But I agree. I mean, I went to meetings where there would be an army of officials and sat with my cabinet colleagues, and you were dying to get some really good, hard-hitting advice. I always said, you know, I wanted the good, the bad and the ugly, but you can't when there's sort of 40-odd people sitting in a room. No one's going to put their head above the water to do it then. So too much collaboration is overwhelming and doesn't produce good results. But you do need to be working across some of those portfolios and working together as a group of ministers and a group of officials. And then I'm with Graham. Then just get on, delegate it to someone to get on and deliver it and trust them.
So the right numbers of people, the right types of people, and that willingness to make decisions as part of the governance is a strong message that came through. And I think that's part of the solution, isn't it? We're certainly ending up at a solution. Maarten, any last comment from?
Well, I was just thinking of what Anne was saying there. You know, I think our cabinet system with the committees actually works pretty well. I've sat in hundreds of those cabinet committee meetings, and there are, you know, most cabinet committees are 10 or 12 people, and there's a, you know, sitting from the foot of the table, as I always was, there's the PM and the senior ministers who've, you know, got a bit more grey hair and experience, a few stab marks on their back, and then there are ones who are learning the ropes a bit more. But when they come together, it's very powerful and pretty impressive to see. And the clarity of thinking and the willingness to take a decision, and the fact that you don't have hundreds of officials in those rooms or all of the backbenchers or the whole of the caucus is a really, really good thing. And that's, I think, one of the enduring benefits of the way New Zealand Prime Ministers have always continued to run our cabinet system, which is that it's ministers only. And long may that last. I was advised by some of my central agency colleagues when a certain government came into power that we should make a strong bid that the head of the Prime Minister's department should also sit in the cabinet office, in the cabinet meeting. And I said, I'm not going to do that, and I will not propose it, and that's it. It's a ministerial and political space, and they need to have the full authority, and they need to take responsibility for it, and they take the advice and stuff. So that works well, but, you know, concentrating the decision-making in that sort of way, I think, is really beneficial.
And I think ending on that authority and responsibility is actually quite a nice way to end the governments on, isn't it? We're out of time now. Our next panel coming up is infrastructure, housing and development, so Matt will be taking over. So you can see there are strong linkages between all of these panels, but what a wonderful set of insights we've had from our 3 speakers today. I thank them all very much for their insights, and sometimes from a little bit of distance that you've had from decisions that you were involved with in the past. They were able to really bring a wealth of experience and insights to us. So thank you very much to all of you.